Royal Murder and Mystery. The Princes in the Tower refers to the apparent murder in England in the 1480s of the deposed King Edward V of England and Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. These two brothers were the only sons of King Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodward, surviving at the time of their father's death in 1483. When they were 12 and 9 years old, respectively, they were lodged in the Tower of London by their paternal uncle and all-powerful regent, the Duke of Gloucester. This was supposedly in preparation for Edward V's forthcoming coronation. However, before the young king could be crowned, he and his brother were declared illegitimate. Gloucester ascended to the throne as Richard III. It is unclear what happened to the boys after the last recorded sighting of them in the tower. It is generally assumed that they were murdered. A common hypothesis is that they were killed by Richard in an attempt to secure his hold on the throne. Their deaths may have occurred sometime in 1483, but apart from their disappearance, the only evidence is circumstantial. As a result, several other hypotheses about their fate have been proposed, including the suggestion that they were murdered by their maternal uncle, the Duke of Buckingham, or future brother-in-law, King Henry VII, among others. It has also been suggested that one or both princes may have escaped assassination. In 1487, Lambert Simnel initially claimed to be the Duke of York, but later claimed to be York's cousin, the Earl of Warwick. From 1491 until his capture in 1497, Perkin Warbeck claimed to be the Duke of York, having supposedly escaped to Flanders. Warbeck's claim was supported by some contemporaries, including York's aunt, the Duchess of Burgundy. In 1674, workmen at the tower dug up, from under the staircase, a wooden box containing two small human skeletons. The bones were widely accepted at the time as those of the princes, but that has not been proven and is far from certain. King Charles II had the bones buried in Westminster Abbey, where they remain. On April 9, 1483, Edward IV of England died unexpectedly after an illness lasting around 3 weeks. At the time, Edward's son, the new king, Edward V, was at Ludlow Castle, and the dead king's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was at Middleham Castle in Yorkshire. The news reached Gloucester around April 15th, although he may have been forewarned of Edward's illness. It is reported that he went to York Minster to publicly pledge his loyalty to his new king. The Croyland Chronicle states that, before his death, Edward IV designated his brother Gloucester as Lord Protector. Edward's request may not have mattered, however, since, as the precedent of Henry V showed, the Privy Council was not bound to follow the wishes of a dead king. Edward V and Gloucester arrived in London together. Plans continued for Edward's coronation, but the date was postponed from May 4th to June 25th. On May 19, 1483, Edward was lodged in the Tower of London, then the traditional residence of monarchs prior to coronation. On June 16th, he was joined by his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, who was previously in sanctuary. At this point, the date of Edward's coronation was indefinitely postponed by his uncle, Gloucester. On Sunday, June 22nd, a sermon was preached by Dr. Ralph Shaw, brother of Lord Mayor of London, at St. Paul's Cross, claiming Gloucester to be the only legitimate heir of the House of York. On June 25th, a group of lords, knights, and gentlemen petitioned Richard to take the throne. Both princes were subsequently declared illegitimate by Parliament. This was confirmed in 1484 by an Act of Parliament known as Titulus Regius. The Act stated that Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodward's marriage was invalid because Edward's pre-contract of marriage with Lady Eleanor Butler. Gloucester was crowned King Richard III of England on July 6th. The declaration of the boys' illegitimacy had been described by Rosemary Horrocks as an ex post facto. The declaration of the boys' illegitimacy has been described by Rosemary Horrocks as an ex post facto justification for Richard's ascension. Dominic Mancini, an Italian friar who visited England in the 1480s and who was in London in the spring and summer of 1483, recorded that after Richard III seized the throne, Edward and his younger brother Richard were taken into the inner apartments of the Tower, and then were seen less and less until they disappeared altogether. Mancini records that during this period Edward was regularly visited by a doctor, who reported that Edward, like a victim prepared for sacrifice, sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, because he believed that death was facing him. The Latin reference to Argentinus Medicus was originally translated as a Strasbourg doctor. However, D.E. Rhodes suggests it may actually refer to Dr. Argentine, whom Rhodes identifies as John Argentine, an English physician who later served as Provost of King's College, Cambridge, and as Doctor to Arthur, Prince of Wales, eldest son of King Henry VII of England, Henry Tudor. There are reports of the two princes being seen playing in the Tower grounds shortly after Richard joined his brother, but there are no recorded sightings of either of them after the summer of 1483. An attempt to rescue them in late July failed. Their fates remained an enduring mystery. Many historians believe the princes were murdered. Some have suggested that the act may have happened towards the end of the summer of 1483. Maurice Keene argues that the rebellion against Richard in 1483 initially aimed to rescue Edward V and his brother from the Tower before it was too late, but that when the Duke of Buckingham became involved, it shifted to support Henry Tudor because Buckingham almost certainly knew that the princes in the Tower were dead. Alison Weir proposes September the 3rd, 1483 as a potential date. However, Weir's work has been criticized for arriving at a conclusion that depends more on her own imagination than on the uncertain evidence she has so misleadingly presented. Clemens Markham suggests that the princes may have been alive as late as July of 1484, pointing to the regulations issued by Richard III's household which stated the children should be together at one breakfast. James Gardner, however, argues that it is unclear to whom the phrase "the children" alludes, and that it may not have been of reference to the princes. It may refer to Edward, Earl of Warwick, son of the Duke of Clarence, and Edward IV's two youngest daughters, Catherine and Bridget, all of whom were living under Richard's care at Sheriff Hutton. Other than their disappearance, there is no direct evidence that the princes were murdered, and no reliable, well-informed, independent, or impartial sources for the associated events. Nevertheless, following their disappearance, rumors quickly spread that they had been murdered. Only one contemporary narrative account of the boys' time in the Tower exists, that of Dominic Mancini. Mancini's account was not discovered until 1934 in the Municipal Library in Lisle. Later accounts, written after the accession of Henry Tudor, are often claimed to be biased or influenced by Tudor propaganda. 4 unidentified bodies have been found which are considered possibly connected with the events of this period. 2 at the Tower of London and 2 in St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. Those found in the Tower were buried in Westminster Abbey, but authorities have refused to allow either set of remains to be subjected to DNA analysis to positively identify them as the remains of the princes. Several sources suggest there were rumors of the princes' death in the time following their disappearance. Rumors of murder also spread to France. In January 1484, Lord Chancellor of France urged the Estates General to take warning from the fate of the princes as their own king. Charles VIII was only 13. The early reports, including that of Rochefort, Philippe de Comines, French politician, Caspar Weinreich, contemporary German chronicler, and Jan Auritz, recorder of Rotterdam, all state that Richard killed the princes before he seized the throne, thus before June 1483. De Comines' memoirs, circa 1500, however, identifies the Duke of Buckingham as the person who put them to death. Only Mancini's account is contemporary, having been written in London before November 1483. The Croyland Chronicle and De Comines' account were written 3 and 17 years later, respectively, and thus after Richard III's death and the accession of Henry VII. Markham, writing long before Mancini's account was discovered, argued that some accounts, including the Croyland Chronicles, might have been authored or heavily influenced by John Morton, Archbishop of Canterbury, in order to incriminate Richard III.